So, yes, I did change my shirt for this video, and I want to talk about some of the worst of last year. These are the movies that I don't want to think about anymore. These are the movies that came out in 2022, and they should stay in 2022. We should not bring these movies up again. And while making this list, this one was actually a little bit more difficult, surprisingly, because there were a lot of movies this year that I just didn't care for, but a lot of movies I didn't see never really qualified as like being so bad that they deserve a mention in this video. But this year was a pretty solid year, as you can see from my best of the year video. This list is the ones that I'd rather forget about. So let's dive into the worst movies of 2022, and I just hope that after this video, I never have to talk about these movies ever again. So let's start off with my honorable mentions, including Fantastic Beasts: The Secrets of Dumbledore. Now, this franchise, the Fantastic Beasts franchise, not the Harry Potter franchise, but Fantastic Beasts, has accomplished something that has never happened to me while watching a movie franchise before. I had fallen asleep during each entry in this trilogy so far. That has never happened. It may have happened like I fall asleep during a movie, but I never fell asleep consecutively in each entry in a franchise. That is embarrassing. That is really bad. This movie is just so boring. The characters aren't that interesting. It just looks bad. The plot is just absolutely ridiculous and just it's not interesting at the least bit. Even Jude Law and Mads Mikkelsen can't save this movie. Where the Crawdads Sing? Well, I don't care. This movie is another boring movie where I just didn't care about the lead character. It just feels like it never really goes anywhere. And there were just moments where I was just kind of sick to my stomach watching it. You know, if you've seen it, this movie is kind of just a dud in my opinion. And I'm shocked that it made as much money as it did. Halloween Ends. This movie is on this list because I feel like the idea of the movie is really fascinating. I really wish I could see it explored in another movie. Not this movie, because it's just two movies in one, and none of them really work. The whole subplot with the whole kid in this movie, it just fell flat. The whole storyline with Michael and Laurie is just sidelined in this entire movie, and only in the last 10 minutes of the movie. This is just embarrassing. This is just a bad way to end this trilogy. It should be Halloween, the original, and then, who cares? Make up your own timeline. Who cares anymore? I don't. Let's talk about the next movie that kind of is similar. Jurassic World Dominion. A movie where, I do like some of the ideas. I do like the main threat in this movie, and I do like the fact that we're bringing the original cast together for this movie. It's just the rest of this movie is awful. It's 2.5 hours. The lead stars of the Jurassic World franchise are not interesting, and I just felt like this is what you come up with for your final entry in this trilogy. It's just ridiculous. It's insane. And the fact that you bring back the original cast can't save this movie either. It falls flat. The Gray Man. Only Chris Evans saved this movie. Everything else is bland, generic. The visuals are terrible. The dialogue's terrible. It's just bad, honestly. Paws of Fury, The Legend of Hank. This was a movie that, let's take Blazing Saddles and we'll dumb it down for kids. Okay, there's nothing wrong with paying homage to a movie in any way. But if your idea of paying homage is just doing the original plot and having a lot of the same lines as the original movie, that is not really an homage. That's just a straight up ripoff. And I just didn't like the characters. The animation is fine and the energy is fine, but I just hated the jokes. I hated the references to Blazing Saddles. Michael Cera, probably the worst character in this entire movie. It's not fun in the least bit. I can see why this movie had been pushed back several times. Only Ricky Gervais surprisingly saved this movie, in my opinion, and I never thought I would say that. But it's bad. You'd be better off watching Blazing Saddles. The 355. This is just another generic, bland, forgettable movie which stars a lot of top talented, a bunch of talented actresses, including Jessica Chastain, Penelope Cruz, Lupita Nyong'o, Diane Kruger, Fan Bingbing, and a movie that is just so generic and just never feels like it wants to be anything more than just a straightforward action movie. When it wasn't being a straightforward action movie, that's when it was fun. Problem is, this movie doesn't want to be fun and wants to take itself so seriously. And it just drained the life out of me. It was boring. I didn't care for it. And I just feel bad that all these actresses were just trapped in this movie. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'm not a big fan of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, so this movie may not be as insulting as I think, but it just doesn't say the fact that the movie itself was just kind of bland, boring. The scares weren't that great. The kills weren't that interesting. Forgettable. Speaking of forgettable, Interceptor. You probably have no idea what this movie is. It stars Chris Hemsworth's wife in a very generic action movie with terrible visuals, a terrible storyline. Just forgettable. And the last honorable mention is called Choose or Die. The reason why this isn't on my worst of the year list is because I found this to be comedically funny, only because like there's a scene where the scary scene is actually not on screen, but you just hear it, and it's the main character playing this game, and it's just so ridiculously over the top, and I just was laughing. I was really laughing during this movie. It wasn't scary. I didn't enjoy it. I enjoyed it for all the wrong reasons, is what I'll say. So now let's get into my actual 10 worst movies of 2022. At number 10, Morbius. I don't care what you Morbheads say. I don't care about this movie. It's uninteresting. It's unfocused. It's just boring. Nothing interesting happens in this movie. Jared Leto's terrible. Most of the side characters are terrible except for Matt Smith. And it looks awful. The cinematography is terrible. Its pacing is terrible. A lot of things in this movie are terrible. The post-credits scene is terrible. I could not enjoy this movie, even as a joke. At number 9, The Invitation. Another movie I didn't review in the last year, but this movie is just so boring to me. And I just couldn't care about anything that happened in this movie. There's like a scene where the main character's talking to her friend, and she's like, oh, I'm going to go for a run. So she goes on a run, she sees something that's scary and wakes up in her bed, and I'm like, when did any of this happen? Like, why did this happen? And the whole stuff with vampires would be really interesting if the main character actually cared. It just seems like she's never really realizing what's going on. And the last 30 minutes of this movie is basically all the vampire stuff going down, and even though there are some interesting twists in this movie, just wasn't enough to save the bland romance, the bland horror, the bland scares, and the terrible visuals. It's just so forgettable, in my opinion. At number 8, Pray for the Devil. This movie is... Why can't we make good exorcism movies? Why can't we make good exorcism movies? Like, The Exorcist is top tier, and nothing else has really worked. Pray for the Devil is just awful. Most of the actors are just awful. It has every single exorcism movie cliche out there. And I was not scared while watching it. I was just rolling my eyes. And on top of that, it has one of the worst endings I had seen all year. Also a trope in exorcism movies. Why do exorcism movies these days have terrible endings? Devil Inside, The Possession, Last Exorcism. Why? Why is this a trend? I hated Pray for the Devil. It was the scary movie for Halloween. It was originally under the name The Devil's Lights, and they pushed it back several times. Even Virginia Madsen from Candyman can't save this movie. At number 7, Firestarter. Oh man, this was one of the first movies I saw after having COVID, so that also didn't help me. But it was just uninteresting. It was flat. It was just nothing sparked with this movie. The main characters I just didn't care for. The visuals were just unbelievably unentertaining. Nothing about this movie is even fun. It's just bland. It's not... Oh, man, that's the theme for this video. Most of these movies to me are just boring. And that is the worst sin you can commit for this list. I just didn't like it. I didn't think it was scary. I didn't think it was involving or intriguing. None of the ideas that were brought up were interesting. They had all been done to death before. I didn't care for Firestarter. At number 6, Easter Sunday. Now, I mentioned this with Pearl. That movie kind of got under my skin, but I said that in a positive way. This movie got under my skin because of how annoying a lot of these characters are. They have so many archetypes that are just so annoying and generic and just seem done to death before. Tell me if you've heard this before. A dad doesn't have time for his son. Yeah, you've heard it all before. It's the same thing. And even though there's like an interesting idea about actors of color who have to have accents in order to get roles, even though it may not call for it, it is interesting, but the movie doesn't really develop that. I didn't care for the family in this movie. It just felt like a really bad episode of a sitcom, and if you see the movie, you'll know that's why it feels like a bad sitcom, but the main family is just unfunny. It just felt like it was unfocused. I didn't laugh once, and I sat through this movie in a theater with nobody else. Think about that for a minute. Any movie that has I Got a Feeling Now, just stop. Just stop. That song died in 2010, and we're still using it. Please stop with it. I didn't laugh. But speaking of not laughing, number 5 is Me Time. You have Kevin Hart, Mark Wahlberg, Regina Hall in this movie, and none of them can save it. It is just an unfunny mess. Just so many jokes that just fall flat. I forgot most of this movie already. I just didn't care for anything that took place in this movie. Just don't watch it. At number 4, The Bubble. This is a shockingly bad movie about filming during the pandemic, done by Judd Apatow, who I usually think is pretty reliable as a director, and it has a really big cast, including people like Karen Gillan, Pedro Pascal, Keegan-Michael Key, David Duchovny, Leslie Mann, I think, is in this. Yeah, she's married to Judd Apatow. But I didn't think any of the jokes are funny. I found a lot of jokes to be in very poor taste. There were a lot of jokes done for shock value. And I just did not laugh at this movie at once. And I just felt like this is a fall from grace for Judd Apatow, because I think he makes some really good comedy dramas for the most part. And this movie is just a straightforward comedy, and I just felt like everything about this movie just fell flat. It just didn't work for me. And it's ironic because Jurassic World Dominion, which this movie is basically parodying the production of, it just doesn't work for me. It's ironic because both of them have been mentioned in this video. At number 3 is Disney's version of Pinocchio. Now, I know there's another Pinocchio version out there that came out this year that has Pauly Shore in it for some reason. Who thought that was a good idea? It's not on this list because I didn't watch it, because I already saw one bad Pinocchio movie, and it was this one. Aside from the production values and some of the performances in this movie, I just hated a lot of this movie. It is both trying so hard to be different from the original movie and trying so hard to be like the original movie. The visuals are terrible. The scenes in this movie just don't make any sense. The songs are mostly forgettable. Most of the jokes fall flat. There's a scene where Pinocchio just stares at a pile of shit. Who thought this was a good idea? And the fact this was from Robert Zemeckis, of all people, it surprises me, and yet it doesn't surprise me, because, yeah, he's the guy who's done movies like Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Castaway. But if you look at his track record for the last few years, I guess it's not really that surprising. Like, what happened, man? What happened? It is just bad. It's one of the worst Disney remakes in recent years. I hated it. So number 2 is going to be a twofer, because they both star the same actor, and they're both pretty much the same movie. But it doesn't matter, because I hated them both, and I can't tell which is worse. Blacklight and Memory, starring Liam Neeson. I am just so done with these movies. I am just annoyed anytime Liam Neeson just comes on the screen and does the same thing over and over again. And with Blacklight, it has one of the most outrageous, ridiculous, nonsensical opening deaths I have ever seen in a movie, at least until the scene in Amsterdam, which if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. But, oh my god, I hated the death. I hated everything about this movie. I thought it wasn't interesting. The whole angle with him having OCD is not that interesting. It's not really played into. Same thing with Memory. He has Alzheimer's. Not really played into. Everyone in these movies are just boring, and they're just flat, and they're just generic, and they're just doing a job rather than actually trying to make a great movie. And it's more disappointing with Memory, because Martin Campbell can be a really good director, but man, both of these movies were terrible. I'm just so over Liam Neeson action movies at this point. It was fun for a while, but now it's just sad. These are just paycheck gigs at this point. And I'm just so sick of them at this point. I may skip the next Liam Neeson action movie, because, man, these movies are just getting worse and worse and more by the numbers every time a new one comes out. But the worst movie of 2022, in my opinion, was Moonfall. You know what? I can't even enjoy this movie as a so bad it's good movie. It is just so bad, it's atrocious. I'm not even just talking about the science of the movie, which obviously I wasn't expecting this movie to be scientifically accurate by any means. But oh my god, it came off as a conspiracy theorist's wet dream of a movie. It made no sense whatsoever. Every character in this movie is a stereotype, it's an archetype, and it just wastes so many talented people like Patrick Wilson, Halle Berry, John Bradley, Donald Sutherland, who only appears in one scene in this movie, Michael Pena. The visuals are terrible. The stakes are not interesting. And again, it's not even like laughably bad. I was just annoyed while watching this movie. It was just awful. It wasn't fun. And to add insult to injury, this was the movie I saw on my birthday. I went to the theater and saw this on my birthday. That made it so much worse, in my opinion. I could have sat through a movie I had already enjoyed, like Spider-Man No Way Home, Scream, Jackass Forever. I could have sat through anything else, but no, I sat through Moonfall and hated myself for doing it. It is awful. It's a parody of a Roland Emmerich movie that just so happens to be directed by Roland Emmerich. It's a shell of his former stuff, and I could not enjoy this movie even as a joke. It's awful. So, those are the worst movies of 2022, in my opinion. What were some of the worst movies of 2022? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe, and let's forget these movies.